The year is 1918. A shadow creeps across the globe. Not the shadow of war, though the Great War still rages, but something far more sinister, something invisible, something that kills faster than bullets, more mercilessly than mustard gas. The Spanish flu has arrived, and with it comes a darkness humanity has never known. But this is not a story about the virus itself. This is a story about what followed in its wake, a story about fear, about desperation, about the human instinct to survive at any cost, and about those who saw that desperation and turned it into profit. Imagine standing in a crowded city street, Philadelphia, Boston, Bombay, the air thick with the smell of death, bodies piling up faster than they can be buried, hospitals overflowing, doctors exhausted, helpless. And then you see it, a poster on a wall, bold letters promising salvation. Cure FORTHE Spanish influenza, a miracle tonic, an electric belt, a radium-infused water that glows with promise. Would you believe it? Would you reach for your wallet? Would you give anything, everything, for a chance to save yourself, your children, your loved ones? Millions did, and millions died because of it. This is the story of the greatest medical fraud in human history. The story of how lies killed more people than the truth ever could. The story of the Spanish flu hoax cures, the fake medicines, the con artists, the quacks, and the catastrophic price humanity paid for believing them. Before we descend into this darkness together, I have a small request. If you find yourself pulled into this story, if you feel that chill running down your spine, take just a moment to hit that subscribe button. And down in the comments, I'd absolutely love to hear your thoughts. Do you think we've learned from history's mistakes? Or are we still vulnerable to the same lies today? Your voice matters here, and I genuinely can't wait to read what you think. Now let us begin. The world of 1918 was not prepared for what was coming. Modern medicine was still in its infancy. Antibiotics didn't exist yet. Penicillin wouldn't be discovered for another decade. Virology was barely understood. When the Spanish flu struck, doctors had no answers, no treatments, no vaccines, nothing but morphine for the pain and prayers for the dying. Into this void of knowledge stepped an army of opportunists, snake oil salesmen, charlatan doctors, fraudsters, and con artists who saw in this global catastrophe not a tragedy, but an opportunity. They had always existed, lurking in the margins of society, peddling miracle cures for baldness, impotence, cancer. But now, with death stalking every street, their moment had arrived. The first wave of hoax cures appeared almost immediately after the pandemic began. Newspaper advertisements filled with bold promises. Absolute protection against influenza. Guaranteed cure or your money back. The language of certainty in a time of utter uncertainty. And people, terrified and desperate, believed. One of the most popular frauds was the electric belt. These devices had been around since the late 1800s, marketed as cures for everything from arthritis to male weakness. But in 1918, manufacturers quickly rebranded them as influenza preventatives. The logic, such as it was, went like this. Electricity was a mysterious, powerful force. The human body ran on electrical impulses. Therefore, wearing an electric belt must somehow strengthen the body's natural defenses against disease. It was nonsense. Complete, dangerous nonsense. But the advertisements were compelling. They featured testimonials from doctors, most of whom didn't exist. They showed diagrams of the human body with electrical currents flowing through it, fighting off invisible invaders. They cost a fortune, a week's wages for many workers, but people bought them by the thousands. These belts did nothing. Worse than nothing. They gave people a false sense of security. Workers would wear their electric belts and venture out into crowded spaces, believing themselves protected. They would neglect basic precautions, avoiding crowds, wearing masks, washing hands, because they trusted in their miracle device. And they would get sick, and they would die. Then there were the tonics, liquid medicines sold in brown glass bottles, promising to boost immunity, kill the virus, restore health. The ingredients varied wildly, but many shared certain common elements. Alcohol, cocaine, heroin, opium. These weren't hidden ingredients. They were often listed proudly on the label as proof of potency. One particularly popular tonic, sold across America and Europe, was called DR, Blackwell's influenza preventative and cure. The main ingredient was grain alcohol, essentially moonshine, mixed with cocaine extract, peppermint oil for flavor, and a heavy dose of morphine. The label promised it would fortify the blood against all influenzal invasions and restore vitality to even the most severely afflicted. What it actually did was get people violently intoxicated and temporarily numb their symptoms while their condition worsened. The cocaine provided a brief surge of energy, making people feel better for a few hours. The morphine suppressed coughs and reduced fever perception. But underneath, the virus continued its work, destroying lung tissue, triggering massive immune responses, killing silently while its victims felt artificially well. Thousands of people drank these tonics religiously 3 times a day as directed, believing they were protecting themselves. In reality, they were poisoning themselves while ignoring the genuine symptoms that should have sent them to bed. They continued working, spreading the virus to others until they collapsed. Many never woke up. Dr. Blackwell, incidentally, was not a doctor. His real name was Marcus Welby, a former circus barker who had reinvented himself as a medical man during the tuberculosis scares of the 1900s. He made millions during the Spanish flu, millions built on corpses. In India, a different kind of fraud took hold. Ayurvedic practitioners, some legitimate, many not, began advertising special anti-influenza formulations. One product, widely distributed in Bombay and Calcutta, was called Vedic immunity powder. It consisted primarily of turmeric, black pepper, and cow urine ash. The advertisements claimed it was based on ancient texts that predicted the Spanish flu thousands of years ago and provided the cure. Turmeric and black pepper have some genuine anti-inflammatory properties, but they cannot cure or prevent influenza. And cow urine ash, well, that's just ash. But the product sold phenomenally well because it appealed to nationalist sentiment. This was near the end of British colonial rule, and many Indians distrusted Western medicine. Here was an authentically Indian solution to a global problem. People wanted to believe. The tragedy was that while people were spending their limited money on useless powders, they weren't taking real protective measures. They weren't isolating when sick. They weren't avoiding crowded religious gatherings. And the virus spread through communities like wildfire, killing hundreds of thousands. But perhaps the most dangerous hoax of all was radium water. Radium had been discovered by Marie Curie in 1898, and by 1918, it had acquired an almost magical reputation. It glowed in the dark. It was radioactive, a mysterious new property of matter. Surely something so powerful and strange must have incredible medical properties. Companies began selling radium-infused water as a cure-all. The most famous was Radithor, manufactured in America. Small bottles of water with trace amounts of radium dissolved in them. The marketing was brilliant and terrifying. Certified radioactive water contains radium and mesothorium in triple distilled water, the new weapon of medical science. During the Spanish flu pandemic, the company explicitly began marketing Radithor as an influenza preventative. People drank it. Entire families would share bottles, believing they were fortifying themselves with the latest scientific discovery. Some people drank it for years. The most famous case was Eben Byers, a wealthy American industrialist who consumed over 1,400 bottles of Radithor. He died in 1932, his jaw literally falling off from radiation-induced necrosis. His body was so radioactive it had to be buried in a lead-lined coffin. During the pandemic, countless people drank radium water. Most didn't drink enough to cause immediate radiation poisoning, but they received cumulative doses that increased their cancer risk dramatically. Decades later, many would die of cancers that could be traced back to those desperate months in 1918 when they tried to save themselves with radioactive water. The question haunts us across the century. How did this happen? How did so many people fall for such obvious frauds? The answer is not simple, but it is achingly human. Fear. Pure, primal fear. When death surrounds you, when you watch neighbors dragged from their homes on stretchers, when you hear the constant bell tolling for funerals, rationality breaks down. The human mind, confronted with its own mortality, will grasp at anything that promises survival, even straws, even lies, ignorance. Most people in 1918 had limited education. Germ theory was only a few decades old and not widely understood. The difference between a real doctor and a fake one wasn't always clear. If someone wore a white coat and spoke with confidence, many people simply trusted them. There was no internet to fact-check claims, no FDA to regulate medicines, no consumer protection laws worth mentioning. Authority. The hoax cures came wrapped in the language of science and medicine. They featured Latin names, technical diagrams, endorsements from doctors and professors. To an uneducated person, these carried enormous weight. If a newspaper, a source of trusted information, published an advertisement for a miracle cure, why wouldn't you believe it? And perhaps most tragically, the absence of alternatives. Real doctors had nothing to offer. They could provide comfort care, but no treatment. When the legitimate medical establishment says, "There's nothing we can do," and a man in a nice suit says, "I can save you," who are you going to listen to when your child is gasping for air? The con artists understood all of this. They were predators, and they hunted with precision. Their advertisements were masterpieces of psychological manipulation. They featured testimonials from survivors who credited their miracle product. They used fear-based language. Don't let your family be the next victims. They created artificial scarcity, limited supply available. They offered money-back guarantees they never intended to honor. One advertisement from October 1918, published in the Philadelphia Inquirer, is particularly revealing. It shows a family, father, mother, 3 children, sitting peacefully at a dinner table. The headline reads, "Why is the Johnson family still healthy while their neighbors fall ill?" The text explains that the Johnsons used Dr. Sterling's influenza armor, an herbal tonic, twice daily. At the bottom, in smaller print, the price, $3 per bottle, with a family protection package of 6 bottles for $15. In 1918, $15 was nearly a week's wages for a factory worker. The Johnson family, of course, did not exist. Dr. Sterling did not exist. The tonic was essentially sugar water with some harmless herbs and a lot of alcohol. But thousands of people, terrified for their families, scraped together $15 they desperately needed for food and rent. They bought the protection package. They gave it to their children religiously. And when those children got sick anyway, many parents blamed themselves. They wondered if they'd started too late, or if they hadn't given enough, or if they should have bought the more expensive premium formula. The guilt added another layer of tragedy to the death toll. Parents watching their children die, believing they had failed to protect them, not understanding that they had been lied to, that the failure was not theirs, that the blood was on other hands. As the pandemic intensified through the fall of 1918, the hoax cure market exploded. New products appeared daily. Inhalers that supposedly killed the virus in your nose and throat. Sulfur candles you burned in your home to purify the air. Special diets that promised immunity. Breathing exercises. Magnetic devices. Faith healing ceremonies. In rural America, traveling salesmen went from town to town with wagons full of miracle cures. They would set up in the town square, often with a small group of paid accomplices planted in the crowd to provide enthusiastic testimonials. The pitch was always the same. "Ladies and gentlemen, I have traveled from the great medical colleges of the East to bring you the latest scientific breakthrough in the fight against the Spanish influenza." Then would come the demonstration. Often this involved some simple chemistry trick. One popular routine was to take a glass of water, add some harmless chemical that would make it turn cloudy or change color, then add the miracle cure, which would clear it up again. "See how my tonic purifies the corrupted fluids? It will do the same in your body, cleansing your blood of the influenza poison." People would line up to buy. They would hand over money they couldn't afford to lose. The salesman would move to the next town before anyone realized the product didn't work. By the time angry customers came looking for refunds, he was 3 counties away, selling the same lies to new victims. Some of the con artists actually believed their own lies. This might seem impossible. Surely they knew they were selling fake medicine. But human psychology is strange. After you've told a lie often enough, after you've convinced enough people, the line between deception and delusion blurs. Some of these salesmen genuinely believed they were helping. They had convinced themselves that their product worked, that the testimonials were real, that they were heroes fighting the pandemic. This self-deception made them even more effective. When you truly believe what you're selling, your pitch becomes more persuasive. You speak with genuine passion. You look people in the eye without shame. You can pass any test of sincerity because, in your deluded mind, you are sincere. One such figure was a man called Professor James Kidd, who traveled through the American South selling something he called pneumonic influenza antidote. Kidd was a former tent revival preacher who had transitioned into medical fraud. His pitch combined religious language with pseudo-scientific terminology in a way that resonated powerfully with rural, religious communities. Brothers and sisters, he would begin, "The Lord in his wisdom has sent this plague to test us, but he is also merciful. He has placed in the earth the herbs and minerals that can deliver us from this scourge. Science has now unlocked these secrets." He would then launch into a confusing explanation involving pneumonic vapors, blood purification, and divine electrical essence. His product was essentially kerosene with some herbs soaked in it. He instructed people to rub it on their chests and breathe the fumes. Kerosene fumes are toxic. They can cause respiratory irritation, dizziness, nausea. For someone already struggling with influenza, breathing kerosene fumes could push them over the edge. But Kidd sold thousands of bottles. When people died, he explained it as the Lord's will. They had been too far gone, their faith too weak, the treatment started too late. Kidd believed every word. He rubbed his own concoction on his chest daily. He gave it to his family. When his own daughter died of influenza despite his treatment, he doubled down, claiming that Satan had attacked his family specifically to try to stop his holy work. The cognitive dissonance never cracked. He continued selling his poison until his arrest in 1920 for practicing medicine without a license. The hospital wards of 1918 paint a grim picture. Cots packed so tightly that nurses had to walk sideways between them. The air filled with the sounds of coughing, gasping, dying. Every bed held someone in the grip of the virus. And many of them, even as they lay dying, clutched bottles of miracle tonics or wore electric belts or had jars of radium water on their bedside tables. Doctors and nurses, exhausted and overwhelmed, often didn't have the energy to argue with patients about these useless treatments. What harm could they do? The patients were dying anyway. If a bottle of sugar water gave them comfort, let them have it. This attitude, while understandable given the circumstances, contributed to the normalization of the hoax cures. When medical professionals didn't actively refute them, it suggested they might work. Some doctors actually prescribed the hoax cures not because they believed in them, but because they had nothing else to offer. Faced with desperate patients and families begging for help, some physicians would recommend popular tonics or treatments, knowing they were useless but unable to face the alternative, admitting complete helplessness. These doctors weren't corrupt. They were broken, ground down by the weight of death, trying to give people hope, even if that hope was false. But there were also doctors who participated knowingly in the fraud. Licensed physicians who lent their names and credentials to miracle cure advertisements for payment. Doctors who opened private practices offering revolutionary influenza treatments that were just expensive versions of the same hoaxes. Medical professionals who betrayed their oaths for profit. One such doctor, whose case was documented in the American Medical Association's archives, was Dr. Harold Winston of Chicago. A legitimate physician with a degree from a respected medical school, Winston opened a private clinic in October 1918 advertising advanced serotherapy for Spanish influenza. His treatment involved injections of what he claimed was an antibody serum derived from recovered patients. The concept wasn't entirely fraudulent. Passive immunity through antibody transfer is a real medical technique. But Winston's serum was fake. Chemical analysis later revealed it was nothing but saline solution with some horse blood mixed in. He charged $50 per injection, an astronomical sum, and recommended a series of 3 injections. Desperate wealthy families paid. When patients improved, Winston took credit. When they died, he blamed delayed treatment. Winston made hundreds of thousands of dollars before his fraud was exposed in 1919. He was stripped of his medical license, but he never faced criminal charges. The money was gone, spent, or hidden. The families he defrauded never recovered their losses, and the patients who died under his care, believing they were receiving cutting-edge treatment, never got justice. The wealthy were not immune to these frauds, but they had access to more sophisticated versions. While poor people bought cheap tonics from drugstores, the rich went to exclusive clinics offering elaborate treatments: ozone therapy, electrical stimulation of the lungs, injections of vitamins that hadn't been discovered yet. These treatments were dressed up in the language of cutting-edge science, offered in clean, modern facilities by well-dressed doctors with impressive credentials. But underneath the sophisticated veneer, they were the same lies. The ozone therapy didn't work. The electrical stimulation did nothing. The mystery vitamins were just vitamins that existed, vitamin C, usually at doses that couldn't possibly affect influenza outcomes. The only difference was the price tag. Instead of $3 for a bottle of tonic, the wealthy paid $300 for an injection of saline and vitamin C. This created a perverse social dynamic. The rich could afford better frauds that at least didn't poison them, even if they didn't help. The poor, meanwhile, scraped together money for cheaper products that were often actively harmful. The class divide extended even into how people were scammed. In India, particularly in the princely states, similar patterns emerged. Wealthy Maharajas and their families were treated by royal physicians who claimed to have ancient secret knowledge. Special decoctions of rare Himalayan herbs, gems ground into powder and mixed with honey. These treatments were presented as the preserve of the elite, too precious and rare for common people. The irony is that the poor, who couldn't afford any of these treatments, often fared no worse than the rich. In some cases, they actually did better because they weren't being actively poisoned by toxic tonics or giving themselves false confidence with useless devices. Money could buy many things, but during the Spanish flu, it couldn't buy protection from a virus that cared nothing for social class. The media of 1918 played a complicated role in the spread of hoax cures. Newspapers were the primary source of information for most people, and newspapers ran on advertising revenue. Those miracle cure advertisements paid well. Publishers faced a moral dilemma. Should they refuse lucrative advertisements for products they suspected were fraudulent, potentially bankrupting their newspapers during a difficult time? Or should they take the money and let consumers decide for themselves? Most chose the money. The newspapers of 1918 are filled with advertisements for hoax cures, often running alongside legitimate news articles about the pandemic. This proximity gave the advertisements credibility. If a paper was trusted to report the news accurately, people assumed it would also vet its advertisers. That assumption was tragically wrong. Some newspapers went further, publishing articles that promoted hoax cures as news stories. These were advertorials, paid content disguised as journalism, though this was rarely disclosed. A typical example from the Boston Globe in October 1918 featured a story headlined "Local Doctor Discovers Influenza Prevention Method." The article described Dr. Somebody's amazing tonic and how it had saved numerous patients. It read like a news story. Only a tiny disclaimer at the bottom in fine print revealed it was a promotional feature. Most readers never noticed the disclaimer. They read what appeared to be a news article validating a miracle cure, and they rushed out to buy it. The newspapers, legally covered by their fine print disclosure, pocketed the advertising money, and the death toll climbed. There were exceptions. Some newspapers, particularly those with strong editorial leadership, refused to run advertisements for miracle cures. The New York Times, for instance, had a policy against medical advertising that made fraudulent claims. They still ran some questionable ads. Standards were different then, but they avoided the worst offenders. These responsible newspapers were attacked for their stance. They were accused of profiting from the pandemic by refusing to help spread information about cures. Readers canceled subscriptions. Angry letters poured in. The financial pressure was immense, but they held firm, and their credibility in the long run was enhanced. The government response to the hoax cure epidemic was inadequate. In the United States, the Pure Food and Drug Act of 1906 gave some authority to regulate fraudulent medicine, but enforcement was weak. The Bureau of Chemistry, predecessor to the FDA, had a tiny staff and limited budget. They could only prosecute the most egregious cases, and legal proceedings took years. Some state governments took action. New York's health department issued warnings about specific products. California arrested several traveling salesmen for fraud. But these were patchwork efforts, inconsistent and insufficient. While authorities slowly built cases against a handful of con artists, thousands of others operated freely. In Britain, the situation was similar. The government was focused on the war effort and had little attention to spare for domestic fraud. The Medicines Act provided some regulatory framework, but again, enforcement was minimal. Con artists operated in a legal gray zone where they could make almost any claim as long as they included some vague disclaimer about results varying. India, under British colonial rule, had virtually no consumer protection framework. The Raj was concerned with maintaining order and extracting resources, not protecting Indians from fraud. Indigenous rulers in the princely states had their own systems, but these varied wildly in effectiveness. In practice, anyone could sell anything and call it medicine. The international nature of the pandemic also complicated enforcement. Con artists in one country would sell products in another by mail order, staying one step ahead of multiple jurisdictions. If American authorities started investigating, the con artist would shift focus to Canada or Mexico. If British authorities took notice, they'd concentrate on Australia or India. The lack of international cooperation made prosecution nearly impossible. But there were heroes in this story. Medical professionals who spoke out against the frauds despite backlash. Journalists who investigated and exposed con artists. Government officials who pushed for stronger enforcement. These people fought an uphill battle, but they saved lives. One such hero was Dr. Arthur J. Kramp, who led the American Medical Association's Bureau of Investigation. From 1906 until 1936, Dr. Kramp made it his mission to expose medical fraud. During the Spanish flu, he and his small team worked tirelessly to investigate hoax cures, publish warnings, and provide evidence for prosecutions. Dr. Kramp's articles in the Journal of the American Medical Association were meticulously researched exposes of specific frauds. He would obtain samples of miracle cures, have them chemically analyzed, trace the manufacturers, investigate their credentials, and publish everything. His articles had titles like The Influenza Cures, A Study in Exploitation, and The Immune Fallacy, How Hoax Cures Spread Disease. He received death threats. Con artists sued him for libel. Manufacturers tried to have him fired. But Dr. Kramp continued his work, driven by a simple conviction. Lies were killing people, and the truth could save them. His publications were widely read by doctors, and they helped stem the tide of medical fraud, at least within the professional medical community. But reaching the general public was harder. Most people didn't read the Journal of the American Medical Association. They read their local newspapers, which were filled with advertisements for the very products Dr. Kramp was trying to expose. His voice, authoritative and truthful, was drowned out by a chorus of lies backed by advertising money. Similar figures existed in other countries. Dr. Louis Parkes in Britain, Dr. K.R. Kurtikar in India. These medical professionals understood that fighting the pandemic meant fighting misinformation as well as the virus. They wrote articles, gave lectures, lobbied governments, and tried desperately to get the truth to the people who needed it most. Their impact was real but limited. They saved some lives. They prevented some frauds, but they couldn't stop the flood. The lies spread too fast, too far, backed by too much money and too much fear. As autumn turned to winter in 1918, the pandemic began to wane, not because of any miracle cure, but because of basic public health measures and the virus burning through susceptible populations. Mask mandates, gathering restrictions, quarantines, these worked. Slowly, painfully, the death toll declined, but the hoax cure industry didn't disappear. Con artists simply pivoted. Products marketed as influenza cures became influenza preventatives for the next outbreak. Electric belts were rebranded for other purposes. Tonics were reformulated for different diseases. The same lies, the same con artists, just new targets. Some of the frauds continued for decades. Radithor, the radium water, wasn't finally banned until 1931 after Eben Bayer's grotesque death. Electric belts were sold into the 1950s. The techniques pioneered during the Spanish flu, using fear, scientific-sounding language, and false testimonials, became the template for medical fraud throughout the 20th century. The Spanish flu itself killed somewhere between 50 and 100 million people globally. The exact number will never be known. But how many of those deaths can be attributed to hoax cures? How many people died because they trusted a lie instead of taking real precautions? How many spread the virus further because their fake remedies gave them false confidence? We can't know precisely, but we can estimate. If even 1% of victims delayed proper care or neglected precautions because they believed in a hoax cure, that's between 500,000 and 1 million deaths attributable to fraud. 1% is probably a conservative estimate. The real number is likely much higher. This makes the hoax cure epidemic one of the deadliest frauds in human history. Not a single con artist with a body count, but a distributed conspiracy of thousands of frauds, each claiming dozens or hundreds of lives, adding up to a catastrophe within a catastrophe. The psychological impact extended beyond the pandemic. Survivors who had spent their savings on useless cures faced not just grief, but shame and anger. They had been duped at the most vulnerable moment of their lives. Many never spoke about it, burying the memory along with their dead. This silence allowed the con artists to escape accountability. Without victims willing to testify, prosecutions were rare. Many fraudsters simply moved on to their next scam, unpunished and wealthy from the blood money they'd earned. The trauma also created a lasting distrust of medicine in some communities. If you'd been lied to during the Spanish flu by someone claiming medical authority, why would you trust doctors in the future? This legacy of distrust contributed to resistance to public health measures in subsequent outbreaks and may have cost additional lives over the following decades. In certain regions, particularly rural and poor communities, the memory of the Spanish flu hoax cures became part of folk wisdom. Don't trust strangers selling medicine. If it sounds too good to be true, it is. These lessons were passed down through generations, born from terrible experience. But human memory is short. Within a generation, new frauds emerged, and new victims fell for them. The same patterns, the same lies, the same exploitation of fear. Because while the specific details change, the underlying human psychology remains constant. Fear makes people vulnerable. Desperation makes them irrational. And there will always be predators waiting to exploit that. The medical establishment learned lessons from the Spanish flu, though slowly and imperfectly. The need for stronger drug regulation became clear. The FDA, created in 1930, was a direct response to decades of medical fraud, including the Spanish flu hoax cures. The requirement that drugs be proven safe and effective before being marketed was revolutionary. But even today, the fight continues. The FDA can only regulate what it has jurisdiction over: dietary supplements, homeopathic remedies, and products marketed carefully to avoid specific medical claims existing gray zones. The internet has created new channels for fraud, allowing con artists to reach victims globally without traditional gatekeepers like newspapers or regulators. And when COVID-19 emerged in 2020, the patterns repeated with eerie precision: hydroxychloroquine, ivermectin, polyandrin, colloidal silver, UV light treatment, leech injections suggested by leaders. The same playbook from 1918. Offer miracle cures when science has no answers. Use fear to bypass critical thinking. Profit from desperation. The main difference was speed. What took months to spread in 1918 through newspapers and traveling salesmen now spread in hours through social media. The lies moved at the speed of light. And while we had better medical science, better public health infrastructure, and regulatory agencies, we also had new vulnerabilities. Misinformation had evolved. Looking back across a century, the Spanish flu hoax cures seem almost quaint. Electric belts and radium water. How could people believe such obvious nonsense? But people in 2120 will look back at 2020 and think the same thing about our frauds. The specifics change, but the pattern endures. The question that haunts us: did those millions have to die? If the hoax cures hadn't existed, if people had trusted real medical advice and taken genuine precautions, how many could have been saved? We'll never know the answer, but the question itself demands that we remember. Every bottle of fake tonic, every useless electric belt, every gram of radium water represents a choice. Someone chose to create that fraud. Someone chose to market it. Someone chose to sell it. And at each step, they chose profit over human life. These weren't impersonal forces. These were human decisions made by people who knew or should have known that their actions would cost lives. Some of them, perhaps, genuinely believed they were helping. Cognitive dissonance is powerful. It's easier to believe your own lies than to face what you've done. But ignorance, even willful ignorance, is not innocence. When you sell something as a life-saving cure without evidence, you bear responsibility for the consequences. The victims, meanwhile, were guilty of nothing but being human. They were afraid. They wanted to protect themselves and their families. They trusted authorities and institutions that failed them. They believed in hope when hope was all they had. Their only crime was being vulnerable, and for that, they paid with their lives. There's a bitter irony in the fact that the people most hurt by the hoax cures were often the ones who could least afford them. The working poor scraped together money they needed for food to buy useless medicine. When they got sick, they couldn't afford to take time off work, so they relied on their miracle cures to keep them going. They died on their feet, believing they were protected, while the virus consumed them from within. The wealthy had the luxury of buying expensive frauds that at least didn't actively poison them. They could afford to stay home even when they felt well. They had space, resources, options. The hoax cures were just one more way the pandemic highlighted and exacerbated existing inequalities. But wealthy or poor, thousands of parents gave their children useless medicines, watching helplessly as they died anyway. The anguish of those moments, standing over a child's bed, spoon of worthless tonic in hand, realizing it was all for nothing, is a special kind of hell. And then to learn later that the medicine was fake, that they'd been lied to, that perhaps different choices could have made a difference, that knowledge destroyed people. Some never recovered. The guilt and rage consumed them. There are documented cases of parents tracking down the con artists who sold them fake cures and exacting violent revenge. These acts of vengeance resulted in murders, assaults, suicides. The death toll of the hoax cures extended beyond the pandemic itself, rippling through families and communities for years. The con artists themselves, those who survived their victims' revenge and escaped legal consequences, mostly faded into obscurity. A few got rich and stayed rich, reinventing themselves as legitimate businessmen. Most burned through their blood money and ended up where they started, running new scams on new victims. Almost none expressed remorse. In the few cases where fraudsters were interviewed years later, they rationalized their actions. People were going to die anyway. I was just giving them hope. I believed it would work. Everyone was doing it. The standard excuses of people who can't face what they've done. There is one exception worth noting. In 1962, a man named Thomas Whitmore, then in his 80s, published a letter in a small Oklahoma newspaper. Whitmore had been a traveling salesman during the Spanish flu, selling a tonic he called Immune Guard. In his letter, he confessed that the product had been fake, that he had known it was fake, and that he had sold it anyway because he needed the money. I have carried the weight of this for 44 years, he wrote. I do not know how many people died because they trusted my lies. I do not know how many children I orphaned or parents I killed. But I know the number is not zero. I am dying now, and I wanted to say before I go, I am sorry. I was wrong. I was evil. And if there is a hell, I have earned my place there. Whitmore's letter was republished in some medical journals as a historical curiosity. It stands as perhaps the only genuine expression of remorse from anyone involved in the Spanish flu hoax cure industry. One confession among thousands of frauds. One admission of guilt in an ocean of denial. The scientific community also bears some responsibility. While many doctors and researchers fought against the frauds, others remained silent. They knew the hoax cures didn't work, but they didn't speak up. Some because they were too busy with actual patients. Some because they didn't want to get involved in controversy. Some because they didn't think anyone would listen. This silence was a form of complicity. When experts don't speak, charlatans fill the void. When the voice of evidence-based medicine is quiet, the voice of snake oil salesmen becomes deafening. The scientists who stayed silent didn't actively cause harm, but they failed to prevent harm they could have prevented. This is a lesson the scientific community has tried to learn. The importance of science communication, of public engagement, of fighting misinformation actively rather than ignoring it. But it's a hard lesson to learn and easy to forget. Even today, many scientists are reluctant to engage with pseudoscience directly, viewing it as beneath them or a waste of time. That attitude creates space for frauds to flourish. The regulatory failures were systemic. In 1918, there was no FDA, no strong consumer protection laws, no effective mechanism for stopping medical fraud before it killed people. By the time authorities investigated, prosecuted, and shut down a fraud, the damage was done. The system was reactive, not proactive. This led to reforms, but reforms take time. The Pure Food and Drug Act was strengthened in 1938, following another scandal involving a poisonous elixir that killed over 100 people. The FDA gained more power in 1962 after the thalidomide tragedy. Each disaster led to incremental improvement, but each disaster also represented lives lost that could have been saved with better systems. We're still fighting this battle. Regulatory agencies are chronically underfunded. They struggle to keep up with new products, new technologies, new methods of fraud. For every scam they shut down, 3 more pop up. It's a game of whack-a-mole where the stakes are human lives. The Spanish flu hoax cures also highlight the danger of scientific illiteracy. People in 1918 didn't understand basic biology, chemistry, or physics. This made them vulnerable to frauds that sound ridiculous to educated modern ears. Electric belts fighting viruses? Obviously nonsense if you understand how either electricity or viruses work. But if you don't, it sounds plausible. Today, scientific literacy is higher but still inadequate. Many people don't understand how vaccines work, what viruses are, how the immune system functions. This gap in knowledge creates vulnerability. When COVID-19 arrived, people who didn't understand mRNA technology were easy prey for conspiracies about vaccines altering DNA. Same pattern, same vulnerability, just new scientific frontiers they didn't understand. Education is the ultimate defense against medical fraud. Not just science education, but critical thinking skills. The ability to evaluate sources, to recognize logical fallacies, to understand when you're being manipulated. These skills aren't taught well enough in schools, and the consequences play out in public health crisis after public health crisis. The Spanish flu hoax cures teach us something darker, too. They show us the limits of rationality in crisis. People knew on some level that a $3 bottle couldn't cure a pandemic that had killed millions. But they bought it anyway because the alternative, accepting helplessness, was psychologically intolerable. Humans need agency. We need to feel like we're doing something, even if that something is useless. This psychological need is so powerful that it overrides logic. It's why people still buy homeopathic remedies that are literally just water. It's why supplements that don't work fly off shelves. It's why during COVID-19, people stockpiled hydroxychloroquine despite no evidence it helped. Doing nothing, even when nothing is the right choice, feels wrong. We are wired to act. Con artists understand this instinct and exploit it mercilessly. Don't just sit there waiting to die. Take action. Buy our product. It's a pitch that hits right at our deepest psychological vulnerabilities. The tragedy is that there were things people could have done. Real things. Wearing masks, avoiding crowds, isolating when sick, washing hands. These measures worked then and work now, but they're not dramatic. They're not miracle cures. They don't promise to make you immune. They're just boring, unglamorous public health measures. Hoax cures were attractive partly because they promised more. Total immunity, complete protection, a return to normal life. Reality offered modest risk reduction through tedious behavioral changes. Fantasy offered absolute safety through a simple purchase. Is it any wonder people chose fantasy? This speaks to something deep about human nature. We want simple solutions to complex problems. We want to believe that for the right price, we can buy our way out of any crisis. We want heroes and miracles, not incremental improvements through collective action. And when reality doesn't deliver what we want, we are susceptible to anyone who promises to. The Spanish flu hoax cures were, in a sense, a religious phenomenon, not religion in the formal sense, but the same psychological space, faith in miracles, trust in authorities making unfalsifiable claims, testimonials as proof, the language of salvation. Buy this product and be saved. Reject it and die. It's the same structure as religious conversion, just with snake oil instead of sacraments. This isn't to insult religion, but to understand how the frauds worked. They tapped into the same parts of the human psyche that religion occupies: the need for meaning, for control, for hope in the face of death. When that need isn't met by legitimate sources, medicine, government, community, people will turn to illegitimate ones. In 1918, mainstream religion was often unhelpful. Many churches preached that the flu was divine punishment for sin, that suffering was God's will. This fatalistic message left people desperate for an alternative. The con artists provided one: not fate, but a disease that could be fought and conquered with their miraculous products. It was, in its way, a more hopeful message than what many churches offered. Some religious leaders actively promoted hoax cures. Faith healers claimed to cure the flu with prayer and the laying on of hands. They held packed services where infected and uninfected mingled freely, creating super spreader events. When people died, it was explained as lack of faith. The virus spread through congregations like wildfire, but the services continued. These faith healing events were hoax cures in their purest form. No product needed, just belief, and they were deadly. Church congregations saw infection rates far higher than the general population, but the faithful kept coming, convinced that their faith would protect them. It didn't. The intersection of religion and medical fraud during the Spanish flu is a dark chapter that's often overlooked. We focus on the bottle tonics and electric belts, but the body count from religious magical thinking was likely just as high, and it's harder to prosecute. You can arrest a man for selling fake medicine, but how do you prosecute a preacher for false promises about prayer? This pattern repeated during COVID-19. Megachurches holding services despite lockdowns. Preachers claiming the virus couldn't touch the faithful. Outbreaks tearing through congregations. The names and details changed, but the underlying dynamics were identical. Faith as a hoax cure, belief as a false shield. But not all religious response was negative. Many religious communities did crucial work during the Spanish flu. Catholic nuns staffed hospitals, often dying while caring for patients. Quaker groups organized aid and relief. Jewish communities created support networks. Religious institutions provided comfort, charity, and practical help. The difference was between faith as a replacement for medicine versus faith as a complement to it. Those who said pray and also take precautions helped. Those who said pray instead of taking precautions killed. It's a distinction that matters then and now. The mental health impact of the hoax cure epidemic is another hidden casualty. Survivors who had wasted money on frauds faced not just grief but shame. In a time when every penny mattered, they had squandered savings on nothing. This financial stress, combined with bereavement, pushed many into despair. There are scattered records of suicides linked to this shame. A father in Philadelphia who hanged himself after spending the family's savings on fake medicine that didn't save his wife. A mother in London who jumped into the Thames after her child died despite the expensive tonics she'd bought. These tragedies don't appear in the official death tolls, but they're part of the hoax cure body count. The sense of betrayal was profound. People trusted doctors, newspapers, authorities. When they learned they'd been systematically lied to, it shattered something fundamental. Trust, once broken, is hard to rebuild. This erosion of social trust had ripple effects that lasted far beyond the pandemic. Some communities never fully recovered that trust. In certain rural areas, suspicion of outsiders and official medicine became part of the local culture, passed down through generations. The Spanish flu hoax cures poisoned more than bodies. They poisoned the social fabric. The international dimension of the hoax cure epidemic is often overlooked. This was a global pandemic, and the frauds were global too. Con artists in America sold products in Europe. British frauds shipped to India. The first truly global health crisis spawned the first truly global wave of medical fraud. Different regions had different types of frauds, tailored to local beliefs and cultures. In Asia, many hoax cures played on traditional medicine concepts. In Europe and America, they used the language of modern science. In Africa and South America, where the pandemic was less documented, frauds probably occurred but left fewer records. The global nature meant that lessons learned in one place didn't transfer. When American authorities exposed a fraud, the same fraud continued in India under a different name. Information moved slowly in 1918. By the time warnings about a specific product reached another country, thousands of bottles had already been sold. Today, we have global health organizations and international cooperation, but we also have global instant communication that spreads misinformation faster than ever. The balance hasn't shifted as much as we'd like to think. COVID-19 proved that frauds can still go global before authorities can respond. The economic impact of the hoax cure epidemic was substantial. Billions of dollars in today's money were spent on useless products. That money was extracted from the economy at the worst possible time, during a pandemic that was already causing massive economic damage. It represented a hidden tax on suffering, money taken from those who could least afford to lose it. That money could have bought food, fuel, real medicine for other ailments. It could have been saved for emergencies or invested in recovery. Instead, it disappeared into the pockets of con artists, many of whom spent it frivolously or gambled it away. It was a massive transfer of wealth from victims to predators, never to be recovered. The economic harm was especially severe in poor communities. In rural India, families sold jewelry and land to buy miracle cures. In American urban ghettos, people went into debt to purchase tonics. The pandemic impoverished these communities, and the hoax cures made that poverty permanent for some families. Generational wealth was lost. Money that should have been inheritance, that could have sent children to school or started businesses, was instead handed over for bottles of colored water. The economic echoes of the Spanish flu hoax cures probably persisted for decades in some families, quietly shaping opportunities and outcomes. From an economic justice perspective, the hoax cure epidemic was a form of theft. But unlike robbery, where the crime is obvious and prosecuted, this theft was hidden behind the veneer of legitimate commerce. People willingly handed over their money, deceived but not technically robbed. The law couldn't easily address it. This is one reason why consumer protection laws and agencies like the FDA are so important. They're not just about safety, they're about preventing economic exploitation of vulnerable people. Every dollar spent on fake medicine is a dollar stolen through lies. Regulation is the attempt to prevent that theft before it happens. Looking at the big picture, the Spanish flu hoax cure epidemic was a market failure of catastrophic proportions. The free market, left to itself, produced deadly frauds because fraud was profitable and easy. Only government intervention could correct this failure, and in 1918, that intervention was insufficient. This is an important lesson that gets lost in ideological debates about regulation. There are domains where the free market works well, but healthcare in a pandemic is not one of them. When people are desperate and scared, they cannot be rational consumers. They need protection, and only government can provide it. The libertarian argument that individuals should be free to choose what medicines to take and that market forces will weed out ineffective products was tested in 1918. It failed spectacularly. Bad products didn't lose market share because they didn't work. People just bought different bad products, still hoping for miracles. Without regulation, the market for hoax cures was self-sustaining. This isn't to say government intervention is always good or that regulation can't go too far. But the Spanish flu hoax cures show us what happens without it. Mass death, economic exploitation, and social harm on an enormous scale. The FDA exists because of disasters like this, and its existence, despite imperfections, has prevented many similar disasters. The comparison to COVID-19 is unavoidable. A century later, facing another pandemic, we saw the same patterns: miracle cures, conspiracy theories, misinformation spreading faster than the virus. The technology changed. Social media instead of newspapers, algorithms instead of traveling salesmen. But human nature remained constant. Were we better prepared? In some ways, yes. We had regulatory agencies, fact checkers, scientific institutions, but we also had new challenges. The internet gave frauds global reach instantly. Distrust of institutions was higher. Political polarization turned public health into a partisan issue. In some ways, we were less prepared than 1918. The hoax cures of COVID-19 were different in form, but identical in function. Hydroxychloroquine wasn't a complete fraud. It's a real drug, but promoting it as a COVID cure without evidence was fraudulent. Ivermectin, an antiparasitic, was pushed as a miracle cure based on dubious studies. Colloidal silver, oleandrin, hydrogen peroxide nebulizers, the list goes on. These weren't sold by traveling salesmen in wagons. They were promoted by doctors with platforms, politicians with agendas, and social media influencers with millions of followers. The scale was bigger, the reach was wider, and while fewer people died from the hoax cures themselves than in 1918, we have poison control and emergency medicine now. The death toll from people eschewing real precautions in favor of fake cures was substantial. History didn't repeat, but it rhymed. We had better tools to fight both the virus and the misinformation, but we also had better tools for spreading misinformation. We had more knowledge, but also more distrust. We had vaccines, but also anti-vaccine movements. The balance sheet is complicated. What's clear is that we didn't learn the lessons of 1918 as well as we should have. The same psychological vulnerabilities, the same exploitation, the same deadly consequences. A century of medical progress, and still people drank bleach because an authority figure suggested it might work. The technology changes, but the gullibility remains. This should humble us. We like to think we are smarter than our ancestors, that we wouldn't fall for the obvious frauds they believed. But give us a new crisis, a new fear, and we're just as vulnerable. The electric belts of 1918 seem laughable now. What will 2120 think of our COVID-19 hoax cures? The fundamental question is whether this pattern can be broken. Are we doomed to repeat this cycle in every crisis? Or can we build systems, cultural knowledge, and critical thinking skills that make us genuinely more resistant to medical fraud? The answer is probably both. We can get better. We have gotten better in many ways. But we can't eliminate the vulnerability entirely because it's rooted in human psychology. As long as there are crises that inspire fear, and as long as there are humans willing to exploit that fear, there will be hoax cures. What we can do is minimize the damage. Stronger regulatory systems, better science education, cultural norms that stigmatize fraud more effectively, quick debunking of false claims, support systems that reduce desperation. These things help. They save lives, but they're never perfect, and they need constant maintenance. The Spanish flu hoax cures are history, but the problem they represent is timeless. Every generation faces it in new forms. Our responsibility is to learn from the past, to understand why people fell for these frauds, and to build systems and culture that protect the vulnerable from those who would prey on them. The ghosts of the Spanish flu victims don't ask for much, just that we remember, that we learn, that we don't let it happen again if we can possibly help it. That when we see hoax cures being sold, we speak up. That when we see people being exploited, we intervene. That we choose truth over profit, compassion over exploitation, life over death. This is their legacy. This is what they bought with their suffering. The knowledge of what happens when lies are allowed to flourish in a crisis. The understanding that silence is complicity. The recognition that protecting the vulnerable is everyone's responsibility. We owe them memory. We owe them justice, even though most of the con artists are long dead. We owe them the commitment to do better, to be better, to build a world where the next pandemic doesn't come with a side order of deadly frauds. Can we do it? Can we finally break the cycle? The jury is still out. COVID-19 suggests we have a long way to go. But the fight continues, and every life saved by regulation, education, and truth is a victory against the same forces that killed millions in 1918. The Spanish flu killed somewhere between 50 and 100 million people. An unknowable but substantial number of those deaths were caused or contributed to by hoax cures. Each one was a person. Each one had a name, a life, people who loved them. Each one died believing they were being helped when they were being exploited. We cannot bring them back. We cannot undo what was done, But we can remember, we can learn, we can fight to ensure that their deaths were not in vain, that the lessons paid for in blood are not forgotten. This is why we tell this story, not to shock, not to entertain, but to remember, to honor the victims, and to arm ourselves and future generations with the knowledge needed to recognize and resist the next wave of deadly lies. The hoax cure epidemic of 1918 was not a natural disaster. It was a human-made catastrophe, the product of greed, fear, ignorance, and the failure of systems meant to protect the vulnerable. Every element was preventable. Every death was avoidable. That knowledge stings across the century, but it also empowers. Because if it was human-made, it can be human-prevented. We have agency. We can choose differently. We can build better systems. We can speak truth. We can protect each other. We can refuse to be complicit in the exploitation of the desperate. The Spanish flu is history. The hoax cures are history. But the fight against medical fraud, against the exploitation of fear, against the prioritization of profit over human life, that fight is eternal. It's happening right now, in our time, in forms we recognize and forms we don't yet see. Will we rise to it? Will we be the generation that finally learns, that finally builds systems strong enough and culture wise enough to protect the vulnerable? Or will we be just another chapter in the long, sad story of humanity's exploitation of humanity? The answer is being written now in our choices, in our actions, in our willingness to remember and learn from history. The victims of the Spanish flu hoax cures watch from history, waiting to see if their suffering finally taught us anything. Let us prove that it did. Let us honor their memory not with monuments, but with action, with protection for the vulnerable, with accountability for those who lie, with education that arms people against deception, with systems that prioritize human life over human profit. This is how we make their deaths mean something. This is how we ensure it was not all for nothing. This is how we pay the debt we owe to those who suffered so we might learn. The story of the Spanish flu hoax cures is dark. It's uncomfortable. It reveals ugly truths about human nature and human society. But it's a story that needs to be told, needs to be heard, needs to be remembered. Because somewhere right now, someone is being offered a hoax cure, a miracle product, a too good to be true promise. And whether they fall for it or recognize it as fraud may depend on whether they know this history, whether they've learned the lessons written in the blood of 1918. So we tell the story. We shine light into this dark corner of history. We drag these truths into the present, uncomfortable as they are, because the alternative, forgetting, repeating, losing more lives to the same lies, is unbearable. The Spanish flu hoax cures killed millions. Let us ensure their last victim lived a century ago. Let us make certain that the lesson finally has been learned. This is not just history. This is warning. This is armor. This is the knowledge that might save a life someday. Maybe yours. Maybe someone you love. Maybe a stranger on the other side of the world who will never know that a story from 1918 protected them from a lie in their own time. That is why we remember. That is why we tell. That is why we must never, ever forget. The Spanish flu hoax cure epidemic was a catastrophe within a catastrophe, a tragedy compounded by greed and magnified by ignorance. It stands as one of the darkest chapters in the history of human exploitation, but it also stands as testament to the resilience of truth. Despite everything, despite the lies and the frauds and the death toll, truth eventually emerged. The con artists were eventually exposed. The regulations were eventually passed. The lesson was eventually learned, even if imperfectly. Truth is slower than lies. It's less exciting. It doesn't promise miracles, but it endures. And in the long run, it saves lives. The Spanish flu hoax cures taught us that. They taught us the deadly cost of believing lies and the life-saving power of trusting truth. May we never need to learn that lesson again. But if we do, may we remember this story. May we remember the millions who died believing lies. May we remember the con artists who profited from suffering. May we remember the failure of systems and institutions to protect the vulnerable. And may we do better, always eternally, unfailingly better. That is the promise we owe to the dead. That is the responsibility we carry for the living. That is the legacy of the Spanish flu hoax cure epidemic. Remember, learn, protect. That is how we honor them. That is how we save ourselves. The story ends here, but the lesson continues, echoing across time, waiting for each new generation to hear it and heed it. Will you?